The ground was still soft from the morning rain when they lowered my son into it. Daniel, 38 years old, gone before he ever got the chance to become the man I always knew he would be. The preacher said something about God's plan, about mysterious ways, about a place with no more sorrow. I stood at the edge of that grave in Clover Hill Cemetery and heard none of it. I just watched the casket disappear into the Tennessee clay and told myself to keep breathing, in and out, one breath at a time. My wife Carol had passed 9 years earlier from a heart that simply gave out too young. I had buried her in this same cemetery, in the row closest to the old oak tree, because she always said she loved the shade. Daniel had stood beside me that day, 29 years old, barely holding himself together. Now, I was the one standing alone, and the oak tree cast its shadow over both of them. My daughter-in-law Vanessa stood to my left, dressed in black so dark it seemed to absorb the pale October light. She wore large sunglasses despite the overcast sky. In 3 hours at that cemetery, I never once saw her cry. Not when the preacher spoke Daniel's name. Not when our neighbors from the county carried the casket. Not when they folded the flag from Daniel's brief military service and handed it to me because there were no children, no other next of kin. She had married my son 2.5 years ago. He had met her at a conference in Nashville, where she claimed to work in commercial real estate development. She was polished, sharp, the kind of woman who always seemed to be doing 3 calculations in her head while smiling at you. Daniel fell hard and fast. I had concerns I kept to myself because Daniel was a grown man and because I wanted to be wrong about her. After the burial, as people drifted toward the parking lot with their casserole dishes and their condolences, Vanessa touched my arm. Her hand was cold even through my coat sleeve. "Robert," she said. "Not Dad. Not Bob. She had never called me anything warm. We need to talk." I nodded. I assumed she meant the estate, the paperwork, the 1,000 logistics of death. "Come out to the property tomorrow," I said. "We'll sit down, go through everything." "No." Her voice had an edge I had not heard before. Or maybe I had always heard it and chosen to ignore it. Now, we walked away from the remaining mourners to a spot near the cemetery gate, under a dogwood that had already dropped all its leaves. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were dry and completely steady. "The mill," she said, "and the 40 acres. Daniel and I were joint tenants on the deed. That means his half transfers directly to me. I've already spoken with an attorney." I blinked. "Vanessa, we buried him an hour ago." "I know when we buried him, Robert." Her tone didn't shift. "I want the transfer completed within 60 days. My attorney will be contacting yours. The fair market value for the timber rights alone puts the property at around $3 million. I'm prepared to offer you 1.2 to buy out your half and avoid a partition lawsuit." The Callahan mill had been in my family for 51 years. My father built the sawmill with his own hands on that land. I had spent my teenage years stacking lumber, learned the trade from the ground up, expanded the operation, installed the modern kiln drying equipment, built the retail storefront. Daniel had grown up running through those wood shavings, had taken over the day-to-day operations 2 years ago while I stepped back. 1.2 million for something worth 3 times that. For something that was worth everything to me, regardless of the number attached to it. "That's not going to happen," I said. Her expression didn't change. 60 days, Robert. After that, I file for partition and a court forces the sale. You'll spend money on attorneys and still lose in the end. This is the generous option." She put her sunglasses back on and walked toward a gray Range Rover parked at the curb. A man was sitting in the driver's seat. I didn't recognize him. I stood there, holding the folded flag from my son's service, watching them drive away. That night, alone in the house I had shared with Carol and raised Daniel in, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of bourbon I never touched and tried to organize my thoughts. The offer was insulting. The timing was barbaric. But underneath the insult and the grief, something else was bothering me. Something I couldn't quite name. Daniel had called me 11 days before he died. Not an unusual call. We talked 2 or 3 times a week. But this one was different. He'd seemed distracted, almost agitated. He said he had found some paperwork in the house that didn't make sense. Something related to the property. He said he needed a few days to verify something before he brought it to me. I had told him to take his time, that I wasn't going anywhere. He had laughed at that, the easy laugh I had heard since he was a boy. I never heard that laugh again. He died 8 days later. His truck went off Route 9 on the long curve above Hensley Creek. The county sheriff's department ruled it an accident. Overcorrection at speed. The guardrail was old and gave way. The truck rolled down 30 feet of embankment into shallow water. By the time anyone found him, it was over. I pulled my phone out and looked at the call history again. Something I had done maybe 50 times since the accident. The last call from Daniel's number was 2 days before he died. I had been at the hardware supply in Maryville and let it go to voicemail, planning to call him back that evening. Something came up and I forgot. The voicemail was just 4 seconds long. Nothing but background noise and then a click, like he'd changed his mind about what he wanted to say. I had not called him back. In 51 years of building and running a business, I had learned that when something feels wrong, it usually is. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I called Walter Pruitt, who had been my family's attorney for over 2 decades. Walter had drawn up my father's original deed, handled Carol's estate, reviewed the business formation documents when I brought Daniel in as a co-owner. "I heard about Daniel," he said before I could speak. "I'm so sorry, Robert. So deeply sorry." I thanked him and told him what Vanessa had said at the cemetery. There was a long pause. "She may be right about the joint tenancy," Walter said slowly. "If that's how the deed reads, survivorship rights transfer automatically. But Robert, I need you to bring me everything. Every document you have related to the property and the business. Every operating agreement, every deed, every amendment, going back to your father's time. Don't sign a single thing. How fast can you look at it? I'll cancel my afternoon. Come in at 2. At 2 o'clock, I spread 30 years of paper across Walter's conference table. He put on his reading glasses and went to work while I sat across from him and drank bad coffee. The session took almost 4 hours. "Robert," Walter said finally, setting down the last document and folding his glasses, "your father was a careful man." He was. When he transferred the property to you in 1997, he did something that a lot of small business owners did on advice from estate planners back then. He placed the mill and the acreage inside a family LLC. You're the managing member. Daniel was a minority member. His ownership interest in the LLC passed to you per the operating agreement upon his death, because the agreement contains a right of first refusal and a survivorship clause within the family bloodline. I stared at him. "So what does that mean for Vanessa?" "It means she has a claim on Daniel's personal assets, whatever was held jointly in their marriage. Checking accounts, the house they rented, personal property. But the mill, the land, those belong to the LLC, and she has no membership interest in the LLC. Her attorney may argue it differently, but they're going to lose that argument. The deed she's looking at is the old deed. The LLC supersedes it." I felt something unknot in my chest, but only slightly. She doesn't know about the LLC. Apparently not. Her attorney may not have dug deep enough, or she moved too fast. Walter looked at me over his glasses. "She was at that cemetery threatening you before Daniel was cold. What do you actually know about this woman?" I told him everything I knew, which was less than I should have known about someone my son had married. On my way home from Walter's office, my phone rang. The name on the screen was Pete Gunderson. Pete had worked at the mill for 14 years, had been Daniel's closest friend since high school, the kind of man who showed up to fix your roof without being asked. "Bob," he said. His voice was careful. "I know this is terrible timing, but something happened this morning. Tell me." Vanessa came to the mill. Before I got there, Eddie was opening up, and she told him she was the new owner and needed access to the office and the safe. She had a man with her, someone Eddie didn't know. They spent about 20 minutes in Daniel's office. Eddie didn't know what to do, so he let them. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Was anything taken?" "That's what I'm calling about. Daniel's laptop is gone, and the external hard drive he kept in the bottom desk drawer. I know about that drive, Bob. He backed up everything on it. Client contracts, supplier agreements, financial records, everything." I drove in silence for a moment. "Pete, before the accident, did Daniel say anything to you about Vanessa, About anything that was bothering him? The pause was long enough that I pulled over. He called me about 2 weeks before, Pete said finally. He was upset. He said he found credit card statements and wire transfer records that Vanessa had been keeping hidden. Money moving out of their joint account to an account he didn't recognize. He said the amounts weren't huge individually, maybe a few thousand here and there, but over 18 months it added up to something significant. He thought maybe $40,000. He was going to confront her? He said he needed to verify it first. He didn't want to be wrong. You know how Daniel was. Always careful. Always wanting to be sure. Pete's voice caught. He said he was going to talk to you. I figured he did. I drove home in the dark and sat in Daniel's old room for a long time, looking at the shelf of baseball trophies that Carol had refused to let me move even after he was grown. The next morning, I drove out to the county sheriff's office. Marcus Tilley had been the sheriff for 12 years, a slow-talking, sharp-eyed man who had known my family for most of that time. I need you to hear something, I said, sitting across from his desk. I told him everything. The phone call from Daniel about the paperwork, the wire transfers Pete had described, Vanessa at the cemetery with a man I didn't recognize, her attorney's demand, the missing laptop. Sheriff Tilley listened without writing anything down, which I had learned over the years meant he was actually paying close attention. You're suggesting the accident wasn't an accident, he said. I'm saying something doesn't feel right. That's all I know. The accident investigation was closed by my predecessor. I came on 6 months ago. He looked at me steadily. I can request the accident file and have my own people look at it. That much I can do. But Robert, these are serious implications. I need you to understand what you're asking. I understand exactly what I'm asking. He nodded slowly. Give me a week, and don't say a word to her or her attorney about any of this. On the 3rd day after the funeral, a process server appeared at my door with court documents. Vanessa had filed for partition of jointly held real property, naming me as defendant. Her attorney's letter, which arrived the same afternoon, repeated the offer of $1.2 million and added a sentence I read 3 times. My client is prepared to accept a cash settlement to avoid the considerable legal expenses that will burden both parties in extended litigation. I called Walter and told him about the filing. Good, he said, which surprised me. Let them file. Now we counter with the LLC documentation and let a judge tell her attorney what I already know. This will be over fast once a judge looks at the actual ownership structure. She took Daniel's laptop from the mill. Walter. There was a silence. That changes things. Call the sheriff. I already had. That evening, a woman I had never met rang my doorbell. She was in her mid-40s, drove a sensible Honda, and introduced herself as Karen Fitch. She said she had seen Daniel's obituary in the Knoxville paper and had driven up from Chattanooga specifically to find me. I worked with Vanessa Cole 4 years ago, she said, standing on my porch because I hadn't yet decided to let a stranger inside. Before she became Vanessa Callahan, I worked at a property development firm downtown. I opened the door wider. Come in. We sat at my kitchen table. She accepted a glass of water and held it without drinking. I want to be clear about why I'm here, she said. I have no obligation to do this, and it's taken me several days to decide that I should. But I read that your son died in a traffic accident, and I saw her name in the paper, and I have spent 4 years trying to forget something I probably should have reported. I waited. Vanessa was let go from our firm under circumstances that were kept very quiet, Karen said. There was a client account she had managed, a commercial development project in Bradley County. Money was redirected from the client escrow. Small amounts, irregular intervals, always with some documented justification. By the time the client's auditor flagged it, almost $60,000 had moved to an account that turned out to belong to a company Vanessa had set up under a different name. Our firm settled quietly with the client to avoid the publicity. Vanessa signed a separation agreement with a non-disclosure clause and left. I set down my own glass carefully. And there was a man involved? Karen looked at me sharply. How did you know that? There's a man with her now. Drives a gray Range Rover. I don't know his name. Derek Hollis, she said. He was a finance contractor who did work for our firm periodically. They were together during that period. I don't know if they stayed together after she left. I got up and found my phone. I pulled up the grainy photo I had taken with my phone in the cemetery parking lot. The Range Rover, a distant figure in the driver's seat, not much more than a shape. I showed it to Karen. She looked at it for a long moment. I can't say for certain from a photo that poor, but the car is the right type. She paused. Mr. Callahan, your son called her company during their relationship a real estate acquisition vehicle. That's the phrase he used when he was explaining to our partners why her commission structure should be reconfigured. He was very polished about it. But what it meant in practice was that she found properties worth taking, found a way into a family, and found a way to extract value. I drove her to the sheriff's office that same night. Marcus Tilley took her statement and let her leave with his card. He called me the next morning. Robert, my investigator pulled the accident file. The original examination of the vehicle was cursory. It was totaled in the rollover, and there was standing water. The primary investigator at the time logged brake failure as a secondary contributing factor to loss of control, but there was no follow-up examination of the brake system before the truck was sent to salvage. He paused. The truck is still at Ridgway's yard. I spoke to Carl Ridgway last night, and he's held it pending my request. I drove out to Ridgway's auto salvage that afternoon with Sheriff Tilley. Carl Ridgway, a heavy-set man who had worked with ruined vehicles for 30 years, walked us back through the yard to where what remained of Daniel's truck sat under a blue tarp. It took the sheriff's forensic contractor 2 hours on site. The rear brake line on the passenger side had a clean separation point inconsistent with fatigue, fracture, or road damage. The contractor, a man named Whitfield who had done accident reconstruction for the state police for 20 years, used words I wrote down because I needed to remember them exactly. Mechanical intervention, unlikely to have occurred during the accident event, consistent with intentional damage to the hydraulic system. I sat in my truck in the salvage yard parking lot for 20 minutes before I was able to start the engine. My son had not made a mistake on that curve. Someone had made sure he wouldn't be able to stop. Sheriff Tilley put me in a conference room and asked me to stay calm and to trust the process. I told him I would. I meant it. The rage I felt was not the explosive kind. It was cold and extremely focused. I drove home and called an old friend named Gary Weston, who had served with me in the Army Reserves decades ago and had later built a successful career as a private investigator in Knoxville. I had seen him maybe twice in 10 years. He answered on the second ring. I need help, I said, discreetly. Tell me. I told him everything. Stay home, Gary said. Give me 72 hours. He called back in 48. Robert. Derek Allen Hollis, 44 years old, Chattanooga. Commercial real estate broker, licensed in Tennessee and Georgia. He and Vanessa Cole have been photographed together at industry events, going back at least 5 years. I have 3 separate sources who placed them as a couple during the period she was married to your son. Gary's voice was flat and professional, but I could hear something underneath it. They are currently staying together at the Marriott in Knoxville under his name. They checked in the day after the funeral. So she was never alone. It was always both of them. Appears so. There's more. He took a breath. I tracked the LLC your son was investigating, the one Karen Fitch pointed to. It's a Tennessee entity registered 18 months ago under the name Delwood Property Holdings. The registered agent is a small law firm in Chattanooga. The managing member is listed as a D. Hollis. But the operating address listed on the registration is a street in Knoxville. What street? He told me. I recognized it immediately. It was the street where my son and Vanessa had rented their house. The house Vanessa was still occupying. She registered the company from their home address, I said. On a weekend when I suspect your son was somewhere else. He was co-owner of a sawmill and a fairly physical operation. My guess is she assumed he would never look at a state business entity database. But he did. He did. Gary paused again. Robert, I have to tell you something else. I pulled travel records, credit card usage, publicly available data. Derek Hollis rented a vehicle from Enterprise in Maryville the Thursday before your son's accident. He returned it Monday morning. The accident was on Saturday. The Thursday before. Daniel had died on a Saturday. He was in the area. He was here. I can place him within 15 miles of Route 9. Gary was quiet for a moment. I know what you're thinking. So does Sheriff Tilly, I assume. I'm taking you to the sheriff's office tomorrow morning. I expected you would. I'll bring everything. The next morning, Gary Weston sat across from Marcus Tilly and two Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agents who had driven up from Nashville. Gary laid out everything methodically, the way he always did. He spoke for 90 minutes. I sat in a chair against the wall and said nothing. When Gary finished, the senior TBI agent, a woman named Patricia Morse, who had the unhurried manner of someone who had seen a great many bad things, looked at me. Mr. Callahan, I want to ask you directly, do you have any concern for your own safety at this point? I thought about it honestly. If they wanted the property, they needed me to sign something or lose in court. Killing me doesn't help them. That's probably right, she said. But I want you to take basic precautions for the next week anyway. How long before you move? She and Sheriff Tilly exchanged a look. We have enough for probable cause today, Tilly said, but we want 2 more days to make it airtight. I drove home and worked in the mill for those 2 days. I stacked lumber that didn't need stacking. I ran the planer on boards that were already flat. I needed to do things with my hands. Pete Gunderson came and worked alongside me without asking questions. He knew something was happening. He just showed up every morning with 2 coffees and worked until dark without needing to know why. On the second evening, I sat on the loading dock where Daniel and I used to sit when he was young, eating the sandwiches Carol had packed for us, talking about everything and nothing. The Tennessee hills were rust and gold in the late October light. The air smelled of sawdust and wood smoke from somewhere across the ridge. I thought about the Saturday Daniel died. I had been at the property all morning, moving some equipment in the back barn. My phone had been inside. When I came in for lunch and checked it, there was a missed call from his number. No voicemail, just the call, at 10:47 inches the morning. The accident was logged at 11:23. He had called me 36 minutes before his brakes failed on that curve. I didn't know what he had wanted to say. Maybe he had finally found what he was looking for and wanted to tell me. Maybe he was scared and wanted to hear my voice. Maybe it was nothing. A pocket dial. A reflex. I would never know. And that not knowing was the thing I was going to carry for the rest of my life. That unanswered call was my particular version of grief. Different from losing him. More specific and more sharp. A splinter I could never reach. I got up off the dock and went inside. On a Thursday morning, 11 days after the funeral, I was at Walter Pruitt's office when my phone rang. Sheriff Tilly. We're executing the warrants now, he said. I thought you'd want to know. Walter looked at me across his desk. I gave him a nod that he understood. I drove to the Marriott and sat in the parking lot. I was not supposed to be there and I knew it, but I needed to see it. Sheriff Tilly's cruisers and 2 TBI vehicles were already at the entrance. I watched from my truck. Derek Hollis came out the main entrance in handcuffs at 9:14 inches the morning, dressed in a polo shirt as though he'd been expecting a different kind of day entirely. He looked toward the parking lot at one point, and I had the impression he was searching for something. Maybe an exit that wasn't there. Vanessa came out 8 minutes later. She was wearing a hotel robe. She had not had time to prepare herself, which meant she had not expected this, which meant some part of her had believed it was actually going to work. That she was going to walk away from this county with a mill that had belonged to my family for 50 years, and that no one was going to be able to prove anything. She looked smaller than she did at the cemetery. Not defeated, not yet, but diminished somehow. Less like a predator and more like a person. I watched the cars pull away, and then I sat in the parking lot for a while longer, doing nothing in particular. The days that followed were logistical and procedural and exhausting in a way that physical work never was. Walter's legal counter against the partition filing was a clean victory. The judge reviewed the LLC operating agreement, the membership interests, and the separation of property elements, and dismissed the claim in less than 2 weeks. The court's written order used the phrase, "no cognizable legal basis," which Walter told me was about as definitive as these things get. Vanessa's attorney withdrew from the case shortly after. The criminal case moved more slowly, the way those things do. Derek Hollis was charged with first-degree murder, vehicular homicide, and conspiracy. Vanessa was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, theft by deception related to the Delwood property holdings transfers, and obstruction of justice for removing the laptop and hard drive from the mill. Their attorneys tried several angles. They argued the brake line finding was inconclusive. They argued Derek's vehicle rental was coincidence. They argued the financial transfers were a legitimate business operation. A forensic accountant, the TBI brought in, spent 2 days dismantling that last argument in detail that was almost boring in its thoroughness. The rental car company's mileage records placed Derek's vehicle within 4 miles of Route 9 on the Saturday morning of the accident. A gas station security camera in Claiborne County, found by Gary Weston after 3 days of methodical work, showed the rental car at 10:12 a.m., heading in the direction of the route Daniel would have taken to our regular Saturday supplier meeting. Vanessa's phone records showed a call to Derek at 10:39 a.m. The call lasted 2 minutes. Daniel's call to me was at 10:47. Karen Fitch testified. Pete Gunderson testified. Carl Ridgway testified. Whitfield, the brake line specialist, testified for nearly a full day. Gary Weston testified. I testified. Derek Hollis took a plea on the second day of trial when the gas station footage was admitted over his attorney's objection. 30 years, no possibility of parole before 25. He read a statement that was clearly written by his lawyer, expressing remorse in the careful language of someone who has been advised what remorse is supposed to sound like. Vanessa went to trial. She did not testify in her own defense. Her attorney argued she had no knowledge of Derek's actions regarding Daniel's vehicle. The jury deliberated for 11 hours, over 2 days. They returned verdicts of guilty on the conspiracy charge, guilty on the financial theft charges, not guilty on the obstruction charge because of a technical issue with the chain of custody on the laptop. She stood at the defense table when the jury foreman read the verdicts. She was wearing a dark suit, and her expression had the same quality it had at the cemetery, that flat, closed-off steadiness. The judge sentenced her to 18 years on the conspiracy charge, plus concurrent time on the financial charges. As the bailiff led her out of the courtroom, she turned once and looked in my direction. I looked back. I don't know what she was looking for. I don't know what she saw. After a moment, she looked away, and the door closed behind her. I walked out of the Claiborne County Courthouse into a November afternoon. The sky was low and white, the kind of sky that comes before the first serious cold. Pete Gunderson was waiting on the front steps, which was exactly where I expected him to be. "It's done?" he said. "It's done." We stood there for a minute, not saying anything, the way men who have known each other long enough sometimes stand together. "You want to get coffee?" Pete asked finally. "I want to go back to the mill," I said. "I want to run the big saw." He nodded like that was the most sensible thing he had heard all week. The mill looked the same as it always had. It will outlast me, which was always the point. The kiln was running. The lumber yard was stacked with red oak and white pine. The loading dock smelled of cut wood and engine oil, and the particular cold smell of November in East Tennessee. I had been breathing that combination of smells since I was 12 years old, and I knew I would breathe it until I couldn't anymore. Daniel's office was still his. I hadn't moved anything. His coffee mug was on his desk. His jacket was on the hook behind the door. His handwriting was on the whiteboard where he had been tracking a supplier negotiation that I would now have to finish. I stood in the doorway for a while, and then I went in and sat down in his chair because it was still his office, and I wasn't changing that. In the months after the trial, I did 2 things I had been thinking about for a long time. The first was establishing the Daniel Callahan Apprenticeship Program, in partnership with a vocational program at the county high school. 2 paid apprenticeship slots per year at Callahan Mill, covering sustainable forestry, milling operations, kiln operation, and small business management. The county school board's response was so enthusiastic it almost made me feel bad that I had waited this long to offer it. Daniel had started as an unpaid teenager, stacking lumber at minimum wage who learned by watching. The kids coming through the program would have something better than that. The second thing was updating the LLC operating agreement to establish a preservation covenant on the property. If something happened to me with no direct heirs, the mill and the 40 acres would pass to a conservation trust with a permanent deed restriction prohibiting residential or commercial development. The timber could be managed sustainably in perpetuity. The mill buildings could be maintained. But no one would ever be able to come in with a checkbook and a scheme and decide that 4 generations of work was just a number on a spreadsheet. The idea that someone had looked at the Callahan mill and seen only a transaction was the thing that still made me angriest when I let myself think about it. Not the greed specifically, not even the violence, but that fundamental failure to understand that some things are not just what they're worth. That a sawmill my father built with borrowed tools in 1973 was not, at its core, a real estate asset or a development opportunity. That it was a place where my wife had brought me lunch for 25 years, where my son had grown from a boy who couldn't lift a 2x4 to a man who could run the whole operation without me. That it was the smell of sawdust and the sound of the big blade and the weight of oak in your hands when you've cut it clean and true. That's not something you can put a number on. And I was furious at anyone who tried. Pete and I worked until dark on the day of the verdict. We didn't talk much, just ran the saw and stacked the lumber and moved through the routine of the place, the way you move through something familiar and necessary. When we finally locked up and stood in the yard in the cold, he put his hand on my shoulder for a moment and then got in his truck. I stood in the yard alone for a while, looking at the lights I had left on in the main shed. The windows glowed yellow in the dark. The big oak at the edge of the property, the one that had been there since my father's time, stood against the night sky with its bare branches. Gary Weston had told me something during the investigation that I had been turning over since. He said that in his experience, people who operated the way Vanessa and Derek operated had usually done it before and believed they were going to do it again. That the reason they were confident was that they had refined the approach across multiple targets and found it worked because most people in grief are exactly as vulnerable as they calculated. What they had not calculated was the LLC my grandfather had insisted my father create in 1997. What they had not calculated was Walter Pruitt's filing cabinet full of 40-year-old documents. What they had not calculated was Pete Gunderson calling me about the missing laptop within hours. What they had not calculated was Karen Fitch driving up from Chattanooga because she had spent 4 years trying to quiet her conscience and finally couldn't. What they had not calculated was that a 63-year-old man who builds things with his hands and has been watching timber for 50 years has a particular kind of patience. The same patience you need to run a sawmill, to look at a raw log and see what's inside it, to take your time and cut it right. The kind of patience that is not passive, that is not waiting, but is a specific disciplined attention that doesn't miss much. I went home. I ate something I don't remember. I went to bed in the same house I had lived in for 31 years. In the room Carol had painted a color we argued about for a week and that I never changed after she was gone. I thought about Daniel. The way he had looked at 16, running the forklift for the first time with that expression of absolute concentration. The way he had looked at his mother's funeral, holding himself very still the way men do when they are afraid that if they stop being still, they will not be able to stop. The way he had looked on the last ordinary day, I remembered with him, 6 weeks before the accident, when we walked the back 40 looking at the new growth on the timber stand we had planted 15 years ago, and he had said, totally unprompted, that he thought we'd have good saw logs from that stand by the time he was 50. Planning ahead the way his grandfather had taught me, the way I had tried to teach him. He was planning to be 50. He was planning to be here. I lay in the dark and let myself feel all of it. The grief and the anger and the strange, small comfort that comes from knowing the thing that happened to your son was not random, was not fate, was not God's mysterious ways. It was 2 specific human beings who made specific choices and were now facing the specific consequences of those choices. There was something solid in that, something I could hold on to when the other feelings were too formless to hold. I was not whole. I did not expect to be whole. You don't lose a son and a wife and come out on the other side of either of those things as the same person you were before. What you come out as is different, lighter in some ways and heavier in others, oriented differently than you were, aware of things you were not aware of before. What I had was the mill, the 40 acres, the smell of cut wood, Pete and the crew, the apprentices we would start bringing in next spring, the covenant I had written into the deed, the knowledge that the thing my father built and my son loved would continue past both of us. That continuation was what I had set out to protect when Vanessa put those documents in my hand at the cemetery. I had protected it. It would stand. I thought about Daniel's voicemail message, the one that was just 4 seconds of background noise. I had listened to it so many times I had worn a groove in it. Sometimes I told myself the background sound was the mill, that he had called from the parking lot before going inside. Other times I didn't tell myself anything and just listened to it. There was still work to do in the morning. There was always work to do. That was not a burden. It was the opposite. I closed my eyes. The mill would be there in the morning, the same as it always was. And that was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.